And this circumstance has to do not only... Sorry. Okay. The international communist movement is yet to overcome the crisis, and this circumstance has to do not only with anti-communist reaction or trends toward revisionism or opportunism, but also with dogmatism which hinders the assimilation of new 21st century conditions. Lenin affirmed that Marxism is not a lifeless dogma, not a completed, ready-made, immutable doctrine, but a living guide to action, thus being bound to reflect the astonishingly abrupt change in the conditions of social life. Such changes, the assimilation and the Marxist understanding thereof, was reflected in the Leninist analysis of imperialism as the monopoly stage of capitalism, which became the scientific basis for Bolshevik revolutionary strategy, as well as a firm response to any sort of dogmatism or opportunism. Since the Great October, imperialism has undergone many quantitative and qualitative changes, but differently than what its defenders assert, imperialism has neither disappeared or become humanized. Quite the contrary, the concentration of capital predicted by Marx and the uneven development which Lenin spoke of has only grown more extreme. 780 million people lack access to clean drinking water. 2.5 billion lack basic sanitation. At least 3.5 million children die from hunger each year. 1% of the global populace controls greater wealth than the remaining 99%. 8 individuals more than the 3.6 billion poor. 88% of the world's millionaires reside in the most developed imperialist states. Of these, 46% in the USA. Whereas in the 19th century, the richest and poorest countries differed by a ratio of 3 to 1, at the end of the 20th century, this ratio was already 74 to 1. This shows the correctness and timeliness of the Marxist-Leninist analysis and critique of capitalism and imperialism, the growing competition of inter-imperialist unions, that of the NATO and EU versus BRICS, the rise of the so-called multipolar world, demonstrate the growth of contradictions within capitalism. Imperialist wars in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya, intervention in Syria, and the refugee crisis that's hitting Europe now. All these facts show that this system is incapable of bringing prosperity or stability to the working class. Manipulative rightist demagogues and left reformists attempt at diverting the attention of the popular masses from the true causes of these evils toward an alleged humanization of the system, or forms of animalistic, racist, and xenophobic demagoguery. This is shown by the left governments existing in Europe today, as well as the wave of so-called Euroscepticism with Brexit at the head. Instead of radical anti-capitalism, the struggle against the imperialist EU is being based on the narrow slogans of bourgeois nationalism. Meanwhile, in Lithuania, there is no truly massive opposition, with the country having joined the EU and occupying a middle position in the imperialist pyramid. Over 1 million people out of a previous population of 3.6 million have emigrated, thus channeling out any greater potential for protest. Whereas EU funds, which are being provided up to 2020, help the ruling class relatively stabilize the domestic situation in spite of growing poverty and inequality. The trade unions are weak, subjugated by the bourgeois social democrats. Anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist protests lack numbers as well as a unified political direction. The Socialist People's Front is going through a deep organizational and ideological crisis. In light of these facts, the only path is a determined cleanse from opportunism, consistent propaganda and organizational work, participation in common opposition movements, and promotion of Marxist-Leninist ideas. The world is gradually heading towards ecological catastrophe. That can only be avoided through actions requiring the operation of major greenhouse effect producing companies to assume a non-profit basis. To blame are not the global poor, but rather the global capitalist class. and the privileged golden billion of the West, constituting the labor aristocracy that is afraid of sacrifices because of too great impoverishment, which Lenin once spoke of. The solution on which depends not only the chance for a better future, for social and moral progress, but even for the existence of humanity, is impossible within the confines of capitalism. Here we cannot disregard the specifics of contemporary capitalist imperialism, the profound gap which exists not only between capital and labor, but also the divide between the most powerful imperialist states and de facto colonial countries. Fidel Castro emphasized this in his speech at Rio de Janeiro in 1992. If we want to save mankind from self-destruction, we have to better distribute the wealth and technologies available in the world. Less luxury and waste by a few countries is needed, so there is less poverty and less hunger on a large part of the earth. Only socialism can solve the problems which are becoming true questions of life or death for mankind. This is the most true, undeniable proof that socialism is today, a century after the Great October, both necessary and timely. For the working people to realize this necessity, that is a job for the whole international communist movement. A theoretical one as regards to arriving at new and up-to-date strategic conclusions for the 21st century, and a practical one undertaking the execution of these conclusions on an international as well as national level. The necessary condition is a creative application of theory free from both dogmatism and revisionism, strict adherence to principle and loyalty to the ideals of the Great October, to the cause of socialism-communism. We are sure that all truly Marxist-Leninist parties fighting for the interests of the working people will go on such a path. And in today's Europe, at the front of these parties undoubtedly stand the Greek communists, to whom we express our sincere thanks for their hospitality and the organizing of this meeting. Long live Marxism-Leninism!
Ευχαριστούμε τον σύντροφο Χρήστο Φέρης. Το λόγο έχει ο σύντροφος